Once just a sparkle in a data enthusiast's eye, the data mesh is coming alive. Many data intensive organizations are realizing the benefits of localized data management and better managed costs. Perhaps more importantly, there's a deep appreciation growing for the value of data products. Check out this episode of Future Proof to hear from data mesh innovator Zhamak Dehghani, along with Sumit Pal and Doug Kimball of Ontotext.
The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness Future Proof.
Today, we're going to ratchet up the rhetoric, if you will, and talk about one of the absolute hottest topics in our business. No, it's not large language models or AI. Those are now the hottest topics for sure. But there's another topic that has really taken the imagination of this industry by storm, and that is this concept of a data mesh. And so before the show today, I was looking up, and of course, we'll have Zhamak Dehghani on from Next Data to talk about that, formerly of ThoughtWorks. And I just did a Google search for top business use cases for data mesh. And oh my goodness, the sponsored links. You have to keep scrolling down these days to get past all those sponsored links. Of course, that's how Google's making lots of money. So who will tell you what data mesh is? Confluent and SnapLogic and Snowflake and Starburst Data and Atlan and IoT Business News and K2View and ThoughtWorks and Monte Carlo Data and Solutions Review and Estuary.dev and McKinsey and DCube and Monte Carlo Data again and Confluent again and SnapLogic again. It just goes on and on and on. These are all of these sponsored links trying to tell you what is a data mesh. Well, there are basic principles to data mesh. One is treating data like products. You want to create data products instead of just databases, for example. That's not a new idea, but it's a really maturing idea, I'll say that. And also localized management and costing, if you will, financing of data projects. So we're getting closer and closer to being able to work these things out. And the person who can certainly tell us what it is from the outset here is Zhamak Dehghani from Next Data, dialing all the way in from across the planet. Zhamak, tell us a bit about yourself and what is this data mesh thing? What are you trying to achieve? And let's get Zhamak on the screen there. Go ahead, Zhamak.
Hi, Eric. Thank you for hosting me. So I think data mesh was an antidote to the problems that the previous paradigms were creating for large and growing organizations that were complex. They had big data aspirations, and they need to innovate with data fast. But they were faced with kind of monolithic bottlenecks. They couldn't innovate fast. They had a monolithic data team and a monolithic data warehouse or lake underneath that. Lead time to get value from data was slow because they had to flow through the pipelines from left to right, from source to destination. That was taking a long time. And we had created a very fragile architecture, right? Every piece of this pipeline will fall apart and it will have cascading effects, downtime effects. So data mesh was an antidote to that. So it analyzed kind of what was the fundamental challenges underpinning the symptoms of these challenges that we were seeing, and it offered an alternative. And as you said, it was introduced really as a set of principles, as a 4 principles, which was first and foremost getting the data ownership or giving the data ownership and data responsibility to the hands of people that are most capable of managing and owning the data long-term as product, who are business domains. As we know, business is moving fast. It has to respond at the speed of the market. It has to manage the data, as close to the market as possible. So instead of having the data owned and managed and controlled by a centralized data team under the CDO, the proposition was, let's give the data ownership and responsibility to the business domains that are tech aligned. And they have tech teams, they have data teams, and they have analytics teams and AI teams, and they're focused on the business and they understand the data. So that domain ownership of the data is the first principle of that. And then following that, to avoid a whole bunch of challenges that would arise from this decentralized ownership of the data, there were other pillars introduced that seem to have found the life of their own. Like data as a product became a thing in itself. As you said, data as a product or data products, long-standing products that these teams own and share, and try to delight the experience of the consumers of the data scientists, data analysts across the organization or beyond the organization is the second pillar. enablement of these teams, these autonomous teams, to own and manage the data through a self-serve platform was the third pillar. And finally, a new model of governance that allows decentralization and yet having some level of standardization and cohesion across these teams with federated computational governance. And none of these, by the way, was novel and new. All of these principles had already been proven, tested, applied in the operational world, in the app dev world, where we moved from at the edge of digitalization, we moved from centralized monolithic teams and IT teams to domain-oriented kind of services teams. It's just applied now to the world of data. So in short, it's just a decentralized socio-technical approach to managing and sharing and accessing data, particularly for analytics and AI.
Yeah, no, those are excellent foundational components. And we were talking before the show about this analogy of Kubernetes, because you mentioned a monolithic architecture. And monolithic, just for those who don't know, if you're in SAP, for example, SAP is a monolithic application. It is this huge pile of code that's supposed to do all these different things. And that's the way we used to build everything, is in big piles of code to build huge applications. Like an enterprise resource planning system is tremendously complex. And then, of course, they went on, they bought some HR stuff and Concur and all these other things that are each of them also monoliths that just got to get bolted together in various ways in processes. But that's not very agile, I guess, is the point, right? And when a system like that crashes or is going slowly, it can be very difficult to fix, to optimize, to figure out what the heck's going on. It's just difficult to deal with. And so what comes along with this whole concept of Kubernetes, which is not just like virtualization like VMware, but it's a similar objective. With virtualization, they were trying to optimize the use of the storage and the compute and all that stuff, because we were using very little of the processors, right? So it's like, well, let's get more value from our data center by virtualizing. Well, with Kubernetes now, you've kind of broken that monolith into thousands of little pieces, these little containers that are really system processes inside a little shell, and they get launched as needed to go do something. So there are a lot of cool things that spun out of that. There was also a whole array of security and governance issues that were born because of that. So that's why we have all these observability vendors now trying to help us understand what's going on out there. But what's cool is that instead, for example, for the audience to understand of a whole website like Twitter just crashing, and now you can't get anywhere, maybe one little button on the page won't work. And the point is, it's because it's all these little bits and pieces that are coming together as needed. And of course, all kinds of innovations have come around for being able to just knock those pods over when they're not working and send another one out there, right? So there are other issues. I like to joke that we sacrificed a state at the altar of scale with all this new modern data stack stuff. It's like, yeah, we can scale up, but we still have to manage state somewhere. So that's a bit of a challenge. But it is a much more efficient system, especially in terms of the granularity of things. And I think that it has enabled the data mesh sort of de facto architecture, because you're talking about breaking up what was, again, a bunch of monoliths connected by pipes into a much different kind of fabric, right? Tell us a bit about that, Jamal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the analogy of Kubernetes and the whole movement around microservices and all the technology that came around to support that model of operation, right? So if you think about kind of service-oriented or microservices as an operating model, data mesh is like that, is an operating model. It's different from the current, as you said, the current operating model is diverse sources, silo sources, pipelined in centralized storage, layered by semantic access governance. That's an operating model. And then we have technology that enables different phases of this operating model. Data mesh is a new operating model. It's a decentralized, it's self-contained, end-to-end responsibility of all the pieces that go into providing a lively data, trustworthy data gets localized to a team. And then they are interconnected through the different types of links, whether the links are consumption provider links or semantic data links. So this operating model now needs a new set of technology to enable it. So what we are working on is to think about, okay, how can we codify this now unit of operation, unit of exchange of value, these data products, and then how can we enable management of lifecycle management of this now unit of exchange of value data product on top of the lakes and the warehouse and the pipelines. I mean, these technologies are not going away. So, people have made tons of investments. So how can we now create a new operating system for this new operating model of data exchange. And I think this is an amazing space for innovation of the next generation data tooling that we will see.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We only got about 5 minutes left in the opening segment, but I do want to bring in Sumit Pal from OntoText. Sumit, first of all, you're a former Gartner analyst. You focused on lake houses and data warehouses and lakehouse architectures and all this stuff. At a certain point, you're like, all right, guys, what are you talking about? Like, I just want to get my data. I just want to build some apps. What are your thoughts about this evolution and how big a deal data mesh is?
Yeah, when I was at Gartner, one of the most common questions was, organizations were craving for clarity. And one of the major questions was, do I go with data lakes, data lakehouse, or data mesh? And that was sort of a wrong question to ask, because as in a data mesh, data mesh promotes this idea of decentralized data teams, right? Where each data team being a domain expert, they know the domain business rules, they know the domain data. And the lakes, data warehouses, lakehouses are part of the data nodes that build the mesh, right? The data nodes interact with each other to build the data mesh. Now, as you were, as Zhamak, as you were talking, you mentioned semantically linking the data. And I think, Eric, you also mentioned early on that how do you semantically make sense of all the data that is across all these different data teams, right? And that is where knowledge graphs come into the picture, where knowledge graphs help you to build the context and the semantic meaning around the data that each of these decentralized data teams are building. The other part is around data sharing, right? As each data team is building their own full stack product or data product, there are data like reference data, MDM data that needs to be referenced, shared, and Zhamak, you mentioned the idea of data exchanges, right? Where these business units, these teams need to exchange the data in a more standardized way, in a more controlled, governed way, where knowledge graphs can again come in, especially knowledge graphs built with RDF technology, which GraphDB from OntoText builds, helps to exchange the data in a more standardized way, right? For example, the whole idea about data contracts, right? Data products need to interact with each other, reference each other with certain data contracts, and knowledge graphs can help you to make sure that the data contracts are adhered to as these data teams are building their products. So those would be my thoughts in terms of how knowledge graphs could be leveraged when you're building data mesh.
Yeah, and real quick here, you mentioned RDF, Resource Description Framework. This is not a new concept. This has been around a long time. And it's interesting. I remember, 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago, we were talking about how the semantic web will be Web 3.0, right? That was going to be the big vision. The semantic web is going to get us there. It never really seemed to fully take off, but I certainly in the business intelligence space now see it all over the place. Like lots of vendors have their own semantic layers, or they're leveraging other semantic layers for the express purpose of being able to kind of funnel the data into the right domain in the right area. So semantics clearly plays a role in data mesh, but it is finally taking off the keen value that semantics can provide. And that's something that RDF gives you, right?
Exactly. RDF allows you to exchange data in a more systematic, standardized way with the data validations in place, with the data with the right kind of data quality, right? Which is again one of the other things about data mesh, is to provide a trustable data that is governed across these data teams. So yes,
Yeah.
correct, you're spot on.
We're talking all things data mesh today on the show. We have Zhamak Dehghani from Next Data, along with Sumit Pal and Doug Kimball of OntoText. And I was joking about how big a deal data mesh has become. Maybe I'll throw it back over to Sumit, and then we'll bring Zhamak and Doug back into the conversation. But Sumit, you and I have been in this industry for a while. I remember how big data took off, then IoT took off, and was talking about IoT data, sensor data, et cetera. AI, AI's been around for, it's been around for 50, 60 years, technically. We've gone through a couple AI winters. I don't think we're going through another AI winter. I think that the large language models are just so significant. And even though we haven't sorted out exactly how they're going to work yet, are such a big deal, that the combination of AI models with data mesh, I think it's going to generate a whole new era of applications and ways of doing business. But what do you think, Sumit?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. I think my guess was, while at Gartner, I used to say to a lot of clients, this decade will probably be the decade of knowledge graphs until sort of LLM crashed our platform. But I still think, knowledge graphs have a lot to do to help LLMs, especially on the context side, right? Especially on the context side, validating the facts, and it's sort of a bi-directional kind of thing that LLMs and knowledge graphs work. LLMs can leverage the context and the semantics that called knowledge graphs provide, and prevent the LLMs from hallucinating. While knowledge graphs can benefit from LLMs in terms of, one of the lowest hanging fruits is to help build the queries that are coming in, help in building the right kind of prompts that go into LLMs to make sure that the right kind of, answer and information gets back. So it's going to be sort of a collaborative thing going forward, in my opinion, with LLMs and knowledge graphs.
Yeah. Or maybe I'll bring Doug Kimball back in just to comment on that real quick. Doug, you and I have talked about knowledge graphs for a while, and I think that they are going to remain a foundational component of information management. They date back to the days of knowledge management. Remember knowledge management? That was going to save the world about 25 years ago, and then never quite got there. I do think with the combination of data mesh as an architecture and large language models as this just tremendous creative generative facilitator is going to fundamentally change how we're acting. It's going to help save a lot of time and effort. I think Zhamak was hinting at that. In the old architectures, there's so much additional work that is just not really necessary to get a particular business problem solved. And so it's like using tractors to move around small pieces of dirt when you can just use your hands, for example. I mean, that's a bit of a strange analogy, but what do you think about the just the coalescing of these technologies and how that's going to affect business getting done?
And by the way, if you want some knowledge management, I've got a SharePoint instance I can sell you. It works great.
That's right.
I like the analogy, and I think that's one of the things I find so intriguing and valuable with the data mesh concept. Not this concept, but the practice is that, to use your tractor and dirt analogy, ultimately, I don't care where the data I'm looking for is coming from. I don't care how I get it. I just want to ask a question and get it answered. The most simplistic process overall. We're just trying to solve for something. And I think that to your point, basically oversimplification of it is make it easy to get information to people's hands. If we look at all the things we're trying to do from a data standpoint, we get into the crunchy, the details, the coding, the apps, etc. But fundamentally, it's about asking a question, getting the information, getting at the right information, getting it trusted, shared across the enterprise. That's what it matters to me. And I think that, yes, it is, I think, becoming more and more mainstream, where knowledge graphs, they've been around for a while, but it's becoming more and more mainstream as people start to realize the impact that it has. ChatGPT, a year ago, very few people had heard about it. Now it's exploding.
Right.
I don't think knowledge graphs are quite there. I don't think data mesh is quite there, but it's starting to lead that direction.
Yeah. I'll bring Zhamak back into this. You talk on your site about decentralization, and I think decentralization is the future. It's kind of funny, when the whole data lake thing took off, I remember asking myself, are we making the same mistake again that we just made with enterprise data warehousing, where we're going to bring it all into one place and keep it there? And isn't it going to get bulky and slow and hard to find things, et cetera? And governance was an afterthought and things of this nature. But I think you are right that decentralization is the future, but maybe you could kind of walk us through how we're going to get there, because every company is going to have its own journey, its own path, its own processes. What are the leading edge companies you're working with? What are they tackling? How are they getting that job done? How is it actually shaking out?
Yeah, so I guess all of the companies that I've seen taking data mesh as a strategy, they have similar attributes in terms of they're complex organizations. The data that they use resides within and outside of the organization, and they need to get timely access to it, to a data that is trustworthy. And they all have pretty aspirational data missions and data visions. Many of their strategic initiatives rely on the data. So most of them have similar pain points, the fragility and slowness of the system. They have made similar investments in technology, the usual suspects that you search and you see data mesh appearing in their advertisement, and they have similar challenges. So where they get started with, at least I encourage them to get started is with this kind of a realistic assessment of, is data mesh the right thing for us? I see a lot of kind of enthusiastic kind of jumping on the bandwagon of data mesh, but without really the honest assessment of, is this right for us? Are we ready for it? Do we have the foundational pieces in place? Do we have the top-down and bottom-up kind of top-down support of the organization, and the kind of the bottom-up readiness of the maturity of the infrastructure and automation and all of these practices that has to be in place? Organizations that I think are most successfully, and they're are kind of applying data mesh, and they're constitute in fact a large portion of our customers, are the folks that they have a data advanced kind of business unit, a business unit that is more modern within the larger organization, and their KPIs, those business kind of owners, their KPIs depend on the readily available data that they can trust and use. So they are motivated to be autonomous. They don't want to be bogged down with this big data team or data organization, but they can't also operate in isolation, right? They can't just go and build a data system in isolation where nobody else can access to their data and use it. So they're those spearheads within large organizations to try data mesh, to show the art of possible, to get some quick value, to demonstrate, how it can be applied and contextualized to their organization, and go from, and because data mesh and technology for it should allow for this incremental, iterative, kind of evolutionary approach in building in the organization. You can go from one domain to another domain to another domain, interconnect those, and that get enough of mass adoption to really leverage it at scale. I think contrary to that, the organizations that probably fail are the ones that have some sort of a big bang top-down transformation where you have to go and spend cycles of years to buy or build a platform on which you then want to build data mesh, right? So that's what I say. That's not a start, because it's a very tall order to create that sort of change and show value fast enough. Our attention span and patience in getting value from the technology are pretty low. Like your initiative is dead. Yes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sumit, I'm going to bring you back in because you had mentioned master data management, and what Zhamak is talking about here in terms of process, in terms of taking it slowly, focusing on one domain, getting that tackled, then maybe moving on to the next domain. That's what we did with master data management, right? You had PIM, product information management, as the first domain. Then you had some customer domains that you want to work on and some other things. But the key was to kind of get it right the first time. And there are some similarities in terms of what you're trying to achieve, right? Because in MDM, you're trying to virtually reconcile systems. That's the way I describe it. MDM allows you to virtually reconcile lots of different information systems that are themselves typically monoliths for a greater strategic goal of doing a better job knowing what's going on in the organization, what should we do, et cetera. I see some similarities, at least in terms of sort of rollout and execution, but what do you think about that, Sumit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think organizations should think big, but start small and then iterate, right? Build on one domain, learn the fundamentals, learn the nuances before they go and start doing the similar kind of thing in another domain, right? And with the MDMs, as you do things like entity disambiguation, entity resolution, knowledge graphs again play a very important role. There are a lot of MDM products out there that are built on top of the semantic underpinnings of knowledge graphs to do data reconciliation and make sure again that the MDM is sort of the single truth around the organization. But again, you have to start small and then build on top of it.
Yeah, and maybe Zhamak, I'll bring you back in just to kind of get into the weeds a bit. Obviously, if you're going to start this journey, it's great, as you suggest, to do so in large organizations that have very complex topographies, if you will, a place where it's really going to make sense to put that extra effort in to kind of get that right. But to me, the skunkworks concept comes to mind of having this sort of advanced analytics team of folks who are really trying to dig in and understand something. And you think big challenges like economics or life sciences or things that really require an appreciation of scale. That, I think, is where data mesh is going to be really powerful. What do you think?
I agree and disagree. So I think I agree that, we want to start small and have, teams that are nimble, agile, and do some skunk work around and get value. But really the value of the data mesh come to exist once you have a large enough mesh. Once you have enough of an interconnectivity that you can then create these higher order, data as value or as product on top. Most of the analytics, like if you look at the, any AI or ML kind of use case, even the simplest reporting use cases require data interconnected from many different domains, right?
Sure.
Pick an example in marketing. So I think while I'm a big fan of grassroots kind of movements and change, we have to be realistic that we need enough of that grassroots and the skunk work connected for data mesh really deliver the value. And I think that is, the balance that sometimes gets lost on us, and because it's just the technology is missing there, is that how can we arrive at, conceptually, the outcome of things like master data management without repeating the same mistakes of the past in how we implement those? Because in the past, many of these concepts are very idealistic, that we shall have one single source of truth. We will have one sense definition of customer. And from practice, we know that's absolutely impossible, because the moment you try to centralize and aggregate all of these different facets of the customer in one entity, the moment you define it is out of date, because the customer aspects in one corner of your organization just change because the business is digitalized, is moving rapidly. They just introduced a new customer channel or capability. So I think that's where, the balance between what data mesh tries to do is this concept that we really need to have, like the single, understanding or reliable understanding of who these customers are, but yet have a very decentralized, maybe skunk worky or kind of domain focused way of emerging these definitions. Again, that gets lost in translation sometimes when we talk about this, or when we think about, okay, we need to have a semantic graph of how these entities relate to each other, right? How do I know that this order is connected to the same customer that called us on the call center, support system? All of this interconnected, but how do we get there in a new way where these are emergent phenomena as opposed to a layer smeared and defined top down on top? Because we have no choice right now. We've got a bunch of data that wasn't initially created as a product. That it was a semantic first definition of a data creation of a data product. So we have no choice right now by try to smear on top these definitions, but the moment we define them again, they're out of date, right? Because they're not defined bottom up and emergent. So I think the movement that needs to happen around the technology moving forward is to think about this data product first, semantic first, quality first approach in building the basics, even the basic foundational elements of data sharing, that more sophisticated, enriched, layers of information and knowledge can emerge from it, as opposed to, well, data is garbage and we don't really understand it, let's push down a definition on top. And that's the switch that needs to happen. And that's kind of, I think, the space for innovation again, to rethink the fundamental units of data sharing so that we can get graphs of knowledge almost for free.